Hi, everybody. My name's Dan Isaac. I work at the University of Exeter as a business intelligence officer as my day job. So I'm probably doing a lot of the same kind of stuff that a lot of you here are doing in terms of identifying data requirements and then going and finding the data and building the reports. But I'm also a data visualization specialist. I've been delivering this data visualization training for nearly 10 years now. Originally inspired by a guy called Stephen Few. And what I'd sort of discovered through his training that I went on and various things I'd read, that there are all these sort of basic hints and tips and principles that we can learn that can help us improve our data visualizations and help us to communicate more effectively. This isn't the stuff that is reserved for technical specialists, and it doesn't matter what kind of tools you're using either, whether you're using Power BI or Tableau or even just plain old Excel. You can just learn these basic principles that will just help your data look better and be much clearer. So that's kind of what I'm all about. As Rachel mentioned, I'll talk for a bit. I'm hoping I will have some time for questions at the end, although I seem to always go over time because I get too excited throughout the presentation. But yeah, I'll have a couple of questions as we go through. I can't actually see the chat or the Menti, but hopefully if you do put questions there, then Rachel can relay them at the end. And obviously at the end, if anyone wants to raise a hand and ask questions as well, that would be great. So I'm going to start off with this data visualization to get us all thinking. Take a moment just to have a look at this and think about what it is communicating. We've got a very serious topic here. But at first, this appears to be a story about violent crime, appears to have spiked. And it's only when you take a moment that you realize that something is actually a bit wrong with this, the way this data has been communicated. And in fact, we've got the time going in the wrong direction. This at first appears, we've got a very convincing and clear title here, violent crime is a very big problem. And then at a glance, we've got a line chart which appears to absolutely back up that claim. It's only when you begin to take a closer look that you realise, well, actually, we're going in the wrong direction. So violent crime was actually much higher in America, sort of 2 or 3 years ago, than it was in 2021. So I use this as an opening example just because it's stuff like this, which is why I find data visualization fascinating. How easy it is to get things wrong and how easy it is to be misled. We all need that skeptical view when we look at visualizations, and we all need to know how to avoid this stuff ourselves. The message from this one, time, we all think of time as flowing left to right. So that is why our line charts, our time series should always flow left to right. We need to be careful about our use of titles. You can see we've got a margin of error here, which again is also problematic in this chart. We might need to think of ways to communicate that uncertainty as well. But this is just one example of the millions of problematic data visualizations that you'll find out there once you know what you're looking for. Also, just to get started off, I wanted to tell a story that some of you may be familiar with. And just to note, some of you in the room probably have seen me before, so this will be kind of a refresher for some of you, but I'm really going back to the basics because I think for most people, and if you're not familiar with data visualizations, this is the best place to start. And this story is the story of Dr. John Snow and the cholera outbreak in 1854 in East London. Now, in 1854, in this area of East London, there was an outbreak of cholera. At the time, nobody knew what caused cholera or how it spread. But what Dr. John Snow did was map this outbreak by taking a map of the area here and by drawing a little black mark everywhere where there had been a death from cholera. Now, as we can see, there was a high congregation of deaths addresses on Broad Street, and in particular around this water pump in the centre of Broad Street. So what did they do? They removed the handle from the water pump, and that was enough to stop the spread of cholera at this time and effectively save lives. The science didn't exist at the time to for people to know that cholera was a waterborne disease and that it could have been spread through that water pump. However, this data visualization provided that insight. It allowed people to see something that they couldn't see without conceptualizing it, without visualizing it in this way. At that extreme end, data visualizations can be a matter of life and death. Simple visualizations which allow us to communicate clearly so that people clearly understand and can solve real world problems are incredibly powerful things to have. Um, During this session, I'm literally just going to run through a handful of the key principles that I can get away with sharing with you in the next sort of half an hour or so. Um, and I just wanted to note this quote, though, from Stephen Few, that the skills required for most effectively displaying information are not intuitive and rely largely on principles which must be learned. I like to share this quote because it's what I'm all about. Too often we kind of will just create the same old charts that we've always created. We'll run through the software wizard and just sort of use whatever it spits out at the end. But we don't take that time just to take a step back and think, actually, is that the right type of chart to use? Am I making the right design decisions here? And so through learning these simple principles of how to communicate more effectively with our data, we can all produce better work and be better in our jobs. These are the 6 principles that I very briefly wanted to run through today. I wanted to talk about the importance of knowing your audience, the importance of trying to tell a good story with your data. I wanted to talk a little bit about psychology and think about the psychology of how to tell the story best with your data. I wanted to introduce or give a refresher on the concept of data ink ratios. That's a really good quick rule that you can use just to assess any data visualization as to whether it's clear and leads with the data. And then a final, more practical points that I can hopefully convince you of, that you should pretty much never use 3D and that you should say no to pie charts. That's always the most thought-provoking topic. So the first point to note here, know your audience. I'm only going to say this very briefly, but in many ways, this is the number 1 tip I would give with any kind of data or data visualization problem. It is the 2 primary considerations you have are that you need to know who is the audience going to be for whatever it is you need to communicate and what questions is it that they need answered. Do not start building anything until you've taken that time to engage with your audience, engage with your customers, to really understand who it is who they are, what questions they need answering. So there's nothing much more to say on that slide. I can't from repeating that again and again, but fundamentally, everything starts there. I like to use this image just as a quick sort of example of this. There's a concept known as desire paths, and I'm sure we've all seen this in our local park, where some clever town planner has sort of designed, a nice path here, but ultimately people want to get over here. And so they've just walked across here and they've created their own desire path in the soil. If we don't know our audience and think about the questions that we want to answer, that's kind of what we end up doing. We end up building these circuitous routes that nobody wants to use, and they'll just use other ways of getting what they want. So we need to make sure that we know our audience and we know what questions they need answered. That's tip 1. Tip 2, again, very briefly, you should try to tell a good story. Stories are incredibly powerful things. Ingrained within human psychology is the sense in which stories can really engage us, really influence us in a way that statistics, numbers just don't. Good quote from Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel Prize winning behavioral economist here, that no one ever made a decision because of a number. They needed a story. And this is true. It is stories that influence us. We can think about this when we watch the news. We can watch the news and you can see various statistics about how many people have died or how many people have been affected by a certain incident. But what really sticks you, what really engages you is those individual stories. How is this affecting people? How is this going to affect me? It is the stories that really engage people and really make an impact. There are various ways that we can think about telling stories with data, but as a starting point and as a very quick hint that I would or a tip, sorry, that I would share with everybody, there's something known as the visual information seeking mantra. This is also known as Schneiderman's mantra because it was created by Ben Schneiderman, a computer scientist at the University of Maryland. And he said that you should give the overview first, then zoom and filter, and then details on demand. Overview first, zoom and filter, then details on demand. This is a mantra which I do tell myself constantly whenever I'm creating data visualizations or dashboards or whatever it may be. A lot of the time people are used to getting the detail and they just kind of expect to get a big dump of data in a CSV file or something along those lines. But ultimately, when we are creating dashboards, when we are communicating with our data, we should aim to give the overview first, i.e. tell the story as much as you can. Then give people the ability to zoom into what they need, apply filters, drill through into whatever it is that they might need to know more about, and only provide the details on demand. Now, this is a very loose way of thinking about how to tell stories with data, but it's a really good starting point. Lead with that overview. And this can be as simple as, instead of sending somebody a CSV file, that bit of time spending a nice front page, which has some simple charts, which give that clear overview. This is the background. This is what I want you to know, and this is what we might want to do about it. That kind of thing. With all of these things, I'd love to go in a lot more detail, but I'm going with trying to give a little bit of various bits of information to share with you. And the next thing I wanted to talk about was psychology. The psychology of how to tell your story best, the psychology of how to effectively communicate with data. This is something that I am particularly interested in. And why I'm talking about psychology, I think, is nicely summarized by this pyramid. This pyramid, which shows us how what we do when we have data, we turn our data into information. We present information to people in such a way that we want to create knowledge in them. And ultimately, we want to give people the knowledge so that they have the wisdom to go make wise, effective decisions based on the data, based on the information that we provided to them. That is what we do when we share our data, when we share our data visualizations with people. So the key thing to note here is that data visualization, despite the word, is not ultimately about data. It's really about getting to the top of this pyramid. As I said, we want to communicate our data as information in such a way that we are really imparting insight, wisdom, knowledge. The biggest challenge for this pyramid, though, is that we can turn our data into information. That's what a data visualization is. It's a way that we've turned our data into a form of information for people to consume. But how do we then bridge this gap between information and knowledge? Information, which exists as ink on a piece of paper or as pixels on a screen, or knowledge that exists as neurons firing in someone's brain. That's a really hard bridge to cross. But visualization, using our visual sense to bridge that gap, is by far the best tool, the best way that we have for doing that. As an example of this, I like to share this visualization from David McCandless based on some research from Tornor Tranders, the bandwidth of our senses. And what Tornor Tranders did was quantify how much information is constantly flowing into our brains through each of our senses. And as you can see, it is sight that absolutely dominates. We are an incredibly visual species. We have this incredible ability to conjure up images and manipulate them within our minds. Visual information, as you can see, dominates significantly more than other senses. So the amount of information we get through touch, through hearing, smell, taste, etc. In fact, it is around 70 to 80% of all of the sense receptors in the human body are in one place. They're in your retina, in your eye. As mentioned, we have this incredible ability to visualize, and a huge proportion of our brain is dedicated to that. But we need to understand how that works. How does our vision work? How do we perceive the information that is presented to us? And there's all kinds of research out there that can help us think about how the kind of strategies that people use when they perceive information, how people perceive the data, the reports, the data visualizations that we present to them. This is just one example from Tableau, some research they did using eye tracking software, where they have asked people to look at some of their dashboards. And as you can see from this heat map, we've got a view of kind of the things that get people's attention, the strategies that they're using to consume information. There's something in the world of UX, user experience design, known as the rule of F. And the rule of F basically says that when you present somebody with a web page, some form of information, they'll start in the top left-hand corner. Generally, because that's how we read. We start in the top left-hand corner and then we read across. We'll then read down the side until the next interesting thing and then read across again. You can vaguely see this sort of F shape here in this dashboard, this sort of rule of F and how that works. That then gives us a kind of clear message we can learn, which is don't bury your most important information down here. Put your headlines, your most important data in that top left-hand corner, because that's the main thing people can be focusing on and what they read first. Consider when you tell your story, that flow of information that people are likely to read from left to right. But you'll notice as well that there are other features of this visualization that have grabbed people's attention. I don't know whether this example was sort of research carried out on an accountant who just kind of liked looking at numbers in particular, but then attention has been drawn to certain different numbers. Things that are colourful have grabbed people's attention. There's all kinds of things that we can learn here to think about how we get someone's attention through our visualization. Related to this, it's important just to think about, again, how people do really, how our sight works, how we perceive any kind of image that is presented to us. Here I have an image here, and a quick question, which is, which of these two orange circles do you think is larger? Now, I'm sure you are probably all thinking that something's up and why I would ask a question like that. I'm hoping it appears to all of us like we have one orange circle which is slightly larger than this orange circle on the left-hand side. I can tell you though, this is an optical illusion. Those two orange circles are exactly the same size. And you can put something straight up to your screen if you really don't believe me. But those two orange circles are exactly the same size. And it is the context in which they're presented which makes us believe that this one is bigger than this one, when the reality is they're not, they're the same size. This is known as the Ebbinghaus illusion. And optical illusions tell us something really important about the world, which is that we don't see the world exactly as it is. We see the world as our brain is constantly interpreting it. And our brains are pretty good at interpreting it. But there are these sort of few strategies, these few things to be aware of. And optical illusions like this give us a good insight into that. I've got now another question for everybody here. I mentioned I can't see a chat or the Menti, but I'm going to ask, and if anybody wants to answer in the Menti or the chat or shout out once you've got an answer, that would be great. The question I have for everybody is, how many number 5s are there on this slide? How many number 5s are there on this slide?
About 5. I know I'm wrong.
So we've got about 5.
5.
Yeah,
I can see 5.
6, I count.
6, yeah.
Yeah, 5 for me.
So we've got a few answers there, a few 5s, 1 6 and another 6.
5s and 6s.
Yeah. Okay, cool. I'm now going to ask the exact same question on the next slide. How many number 5s are there on this slide? Now,
6.
this is making a very obvious point. These two slides are exactly the same. All I have done is made those 5s black instead of grey, and I've made them bold so they jump out at you. Now, though, we can immediately get our answer to that question. We can immediately see there are clearly 6 number 5s there. Our brains can calculate that in a fraction of a second. I have taken a task which took, I think, around 10 to 15 seconds before someone gave the right answer. A large margin for error. I think most people were saying 5. You've clearly not spotted one. It was a very kind of mentally consuming task to count those number 5s to something which was very quick and simple. What this represents is 2 different types of visual processing that human beings are capable of. This first one is known as controlled processing. And with controlled processing, the kind of things you do when you're reading, you're doing this very slow, controlled process of consciously going through and looking for those number 5s. It's slow and it's prone to error. Whereas on this second example, you were able to use something called pre-attentive processing. And pre-attentive means before attention, without having to apply any attention or any conscious effort. Because of the differences in the 5s from the 6s, from all of the other numbers, you can clearly see them. They pop out. They grab your attention. So using pre-attentive processing is a really quick way both to get someone's attention, but to also notice these differences. Now, I'm not going to dwell on this slide because I could talk about this slide for the next 10 minutes and I haven't got enough time, but this is highlighting some of these different pre-attentive attributes, the things that we naturally see differences in. Just to take a couple of examples, length. We all can pre-attentively see that this line is longer than the other lines. We don't have to sort of apply any effort to see that. We just see that difference. That is why bar charts are so effective, why bar charts are the absolute staple of the starting point for all data visualization. Because that pre-attentive difference of length is something that we can all see immediately without any effort, and we can all make really quick, simple judgments about how much longer one line is, one bar is than another. That is why fundamentally on a psychological level, bar charts are so effective. You can think about other types of chart which use these conventions, sort of heat maps and scatter plots. You can also think about how we can use things like different shapes, grid lines and boxes to draw people's attention in certain ways. It's really useful to be aware of these pre-attentive attributes because they really give that core understanding of why people see things the way they do and why good data visualizations work. And we really do need to sort of understand these pre-attentive attributes in order to know how to use them to create good data visualizations. As mentioned, this is a taster and I've not got enough time and happily on the course itself. I go into sort of much more detail in some of that stuff. But in the sort of remaining 10-15 minutes or so, I've got 3 more points that I wanted to raise. The first one being the idea of data-inc ratios. Data-inc ratios are a concept from a guy called Edward Tufte, who's often sort of known as the godfather of sort of the recent interest in data visualization again. What did he mean by data-inc ratios? Well, he asks us to think about every data visualization as involving 2 different things, data-inc and non-data-inc. Now, the data-inc is everything within a data visualization which includes or is representing data. So as mentioned, I work at University of Exeter. So here's a beautiful chart that I mocked up in Excel showing the rise in student numbers at the University of Exeter. The data-inc here is the line that is showing the increase in student numbers. Other pieces of data-inc include the labels. So this labels are telling us the year, this label's telling us the number of students. All of those things, if you take them away, you are removing data from the visualization. Similarly, I'd argue the title. If you took the title away, you wouldn't know we were talking about student numbers at the University of Exeter. So I'd argue that is still data as well. So those things are data-inc. Everything else is non-data-inc. So if you think about the non-data-inc in this example, we've got this yellow background, the blue border around the outside, the blue area under the line, which isn't really the data is contained within the line, the grid lines, the unnecessary decimal places. All of these things count as non-data-inc. So when you understand the difference between non-data-inc and data-inc, the idea is that we should aim to reduce the non-data-inc and enhance the data-inc. Now, when we say reduce the non-data-inc, that doesn't mean get rid of it entirely. It means to get rid of any non-data-inc that isn't actually doing anything useful, and to make sure that any non-data-inc that remains is sort of de-emphasized, regularized, so it doesn't distract from the data itself. Similarly, when we say enhance the data-inc, that doesn't just mean throw all of your data into this visualization so it's completely full of data. It means get rid of any data-inc that isn't relevant to the story that you're trying to tell, and emphasize the data-inc that is most important to the story you're trying to tell. Now, with this in mind, this idea of reducing the non-data-inc and enhancing the data-inc, I could go back to this example and think about how I might improve it. And I came up with this. Now, this isn't going to win any awards for the world's most beautiful data visualization. However, it is absolutely clear. At a glance, you look at this, you know what you're looking at, you see the line going up, you've got a sense of those student numbers going up, the gradient gives you a sense of how much they've gone up. It's incredibly clear. And ultimately, clarity is what we're going for when we want to communicate with our data as quickly and clearly as possible. So as you'll notice, I've taken out all of the non-data ink from this one, except for one thing, which is the grid lines. The grid lines are non-data ink, but actually, in this case, they're helping to enhance the data ink. If you took the grid lines out, it would be more difficult to interpret the gradient of the line, and it would be harder to read the actual data and to sort of see, for example, now we're about 27,500 students. It would be more difficult to read that without the grid lines. But again, the grid lines, they're not there's not too many of them. They're not black, they're just gray. So they're helpful. They support the data ink. But it should always be the data ink that is absolutely at the forefront to create clear, engaging data visualizations. Good quote from Edward Tufte to back this up. Above all else, show the data. It was mentioned to me recently, someone mentioned the squint test. Just sort of once you've created something, just sort of squinting at it. And when you do something like that, again, it should be the data. You should still be able to kind of glance at a bar chart or a line chart and still kind of read what is going on. What is the point of this? Above all else, show the data, and it should be the data that is visually at the forefront. A couple more points then to run through. The next one that I would like to convince you all of is that we should never use 3D within our visualizations. 3D is becoming less and less common. I think this battle is sort of slowly being won, but unfortunately, we still do see some people who are trying to make their visualizations look exciting or engaging or whatever it may be, are still using that 3D option to try and make them look a bit more snazzy and engaging. It doesn't. It looks naff, and more importantly, it makes things increasingly difficult to read and interpret. I couldn't help but share another optical illusion to sort of demonstrate the problem that human beings have with three-dimensional representations of space on two-dimensional surfaces. It looks to us as if this post at the back is larger than the one at the front, when I can tell you that actually, in reality, these three posts, or whatever they are exactly the same size. But it looks basically like we're kind of looking down a tunnel, and these are all on this sort of pavement here. And so, well, this one, it's in the past, it's in the distance, sorry, that must clearly be taller than that. And our brains convince us that's not the case at all. They're all the same size. But problems, distortions like this are the problem with 3D and why we should avoid it. To emphasize this point with a data visualization example, I've got this visualization here that I wanted to share with all of you. This is looking at the 3 top-selling albums of all time in the UK. But to make it more exciting, rather than using a boring old bar chart, I used the picker at the top of Excel, and it gave me this option to create this sort of weird conical spotlight chart. I don't know what you would call it. So I've used this, and I'm trying to communicate what are the 3 top-selling albums in the UK of all time. And my question for you, based on this information, how many copies of Queen's greatest hits have been sold? And again, if you're happy to shout out an answer or pop one in Menti, that would be great. How many copies of Queen's greatest hits do you think have been sold?
Around 5.7 million.
5.7? Any other thoughts?
5.5, 5.2.
5.5, 5.2?
8 million.
8? Yeah. So we've got a pretty big range there already, from 5 million all the way up to 8 million. I can tell you that the correct answer is actually 7 million. Now, some of you are probably wondering, how on earth is that 7 million? I can understand the people who were saying sort of 5.5 million, because you can see kind of that's where it appears to intersect between 4 and 6. Similarly, I can understand the person that said 8 million, because if you go straight across to the left, you are around about the 8 million mark. But because this is 3D and this is very hard to explain, it's even harder to explain over Teams, you've got to imagine that you are looking into a kind of three-dimensional plane here. And each of these bars is sat in the middle of that three-dimensional plane. So actually the point at which this intersects the y-axis is around about here. So it is 7 million. This chart isn't lying to you, but making things 3D is just an incredibly complicated thing for our brain to have to interpret. So that is the problem with 3D data visualizations in a nutshell, and that is why I would recommend avoiding them at all costs. Now, just to note, there may be 1 or 2 people in the room who do something really sophisticated. There is room for three-dimensional charting if you're doing, I don't know, something like virtual reality, where you're able to kind of manipulate these 3D visualizations. And there are people doing incredible things like mapping the ocean floor, because you can't see the ocean floor. Making 3D visualizations of the open floor can be useful. That really is the extreme end of science. And you may be doing something that like similar to that, analogous to that, which does require 3D, but for everyday communication, it should be avoided. And the last point I wanted to share with you is that I think we should all say no to pie charts. And to emphasize this point, I've got one final question for everybody. And again, please shout out, pop something in the chat. How many times bigger do you think this circle is than this circle on the left-hand side? So in terms of area, how many times bigger is this circle than the one on the left?
20.
20?
No, I was going to say 20.
Any other thoughts?
Someone says 10. Between 10 and 20.
Between 10 and 20? We've already got a margin of error there of 100% from 10 to 20. I'm guessing if I could get an answer from absolutely everyone here, I'd usually get answers that range from as low as 5 to as high as 50. The correct answer, for those who said 20, you were reasonably accurate. Well done. The correct answer is 18. The point raised here, though, is that human beings are really bad at making judgments about area, about how much bigger the area of one shape is than another shape. We're really good with length. That's why bar charts work so effectively. We can all glance at 2 lines and sort of get a sense of that line is that much bigger than the other one. We get a really good feel for that. But when it comes to area, we just don't have that ability to make good judgments. And that fundamentally is the problem with pie charts. When we present a pie chart to somebody, we are asking them to make a judgment about how much bigger one segment of pie is than another segment of pie. Now we can kind of do that. And if you were to look at this example, we can see if we can get the orange and the yellow. I think we'd all agree that the orange segment is probably just a little bit bigger than the yellow, but it's quite ambiguous. It's something that we're really not very good at judging. Just to note as well, admittedly, when you present data in a pie chart, you're presenting the data being encoded or represented within the area of each segment. It's also represented in the angle in the middle and in the arc around the outside. However, if you were to look at this as a piece of pie or a piece of cake, you would not be making a judgment about how much bigger the angle is in the center of your cake or how much crust there is around the outside. You are looking at the 2 segments and you are thinking which is bigger than another. That is naturally what we do. And as mentioned, we're just not very good at that. Does making a pie chart 3D and exploding it to get engagement and get people excited during our presentation, does that work? No. This, to me, is about the biggest crime you can possibly commit against data visualization. Again, we still do see these often with people who don't have much experience with presenting data as a way to try and make it engaging. not only does it look kind of old-fashioned and naff, but again, with making things 3D, you create these distortions. In this example, if you look here at the difference between the green and the orange, for example, yes, the green is a little bit smaller than the orange, but here it looks like that orange segment is at least 2-3 times as large. Similarly, all these additional surfaces we've created, these aren't data, they're just things that are necessary to make it look 3D. So yeah, 3D pie charts, absolutely avoid them. I would always recommend that a bar chart will work better than a pie chart. As mentioned, we're really good at reading differences in length. And so for that reason, yeah, I would always say that the data is going to be clearer in a bar chart. People often have very strong opinions about pie charts. There's some big pie charts fans out there who like the fact that they can be colourful, and they like the fact that they clearly show that we're talking about part-to-whole relationships. And there's some interesting discussions to be had there. But I've not used one myself in probably 10 years. I still feel like bar charts, in terms of clarity of communication, they're always the better option. Yeah, happy to hear any questions on that afterwards, though. So there we go, in a nutshell, and I've tried to cover as much as possible without going too quickly. Here are the 6 principles that I'm shared with you today. Remember, know your audience, what questions they need answered. Try to tell a good story. Think about the psychology, how people are visually gonna perceive what you present to them. Be aware of data ink ratios. Reduce your non-data ink and enhance your data ink. And hopefully, yeah, convinced you should never use 3D and say no to pie charts. Simplicity is the ultimate sophistication. This quote's been attributed to various people. I've attributed it to Leonardo da Vinci. Not only does simplicity make things clearer, generally it makes it look more engaging, more elegant, more sophisticated too. Simplicity, as a rule, cannot be overestimated. It's a great place to start with any design. And one last point I like to finish on is the idea of computational kindness. And this is something I like to talk about a lot, just because I've not really heard many other people talking about it. But I got this idea of computational kindness from this book by Brian Christian and Tom Griffiths. And in this book, they looked at the world of computer science and various different algorithms that existed in the world of computer science and tried to apply them to the science of human decision making. Now, there's lots of interesting insights in that book, but their conclusion at the end, they talked about the idea of computational kindness and applying that to human decision making. Now, if you're a computer scientist, the idea of computational kindness says that if you've got 2 programs or 2 scripts, one of them is 2 lines of code and takes a fraction of a second, and the other one is 6,000 lines of code and takes half an hour. This one is computationally kind. It requires less computational resources in order to run that program than it does the other one. Now, if we apply that to the world of human decision making, we can say that for efficiency and effectiveness, we should minimize the amount of mental processing required by our audience. Now, this is a great tip outside the world of data visualization. If I were to have a meeting with one of you, for example, I could say to you, are you free next week? I'm then handing over this mental burden to you where you're having to think, hang on, am I free? What day, what time, where are we going to meet? I'm not being computationally kind. Well, as if I've got an idea, I could just say, well, would you like to meet here at 2 p.m. next Monday? The person then can potentially just say, yeah, that sounds great. I'm being much more computationally kind, and I'm taking on more of that computational burden and taking it away from them. Similarly, when it comes to communicating with data, we could say things like, if I sent an email, you could say, please see the attached, and the person's having to think, oh, who is this person? What is this attachment? Well, there's a simple bit of detail to say, you'll find the attached data confirms X, Y, and Z. That's being computationally kind. Similarly, this was not a computationally kind data visualization. It required a lot of computational cognitive effort for you to understand what the heck you were looking at. Whereas in that case, a simple table gives the answers. And I'm conscious I've not updated this slide, and it has gone up to 7 million now, but I need to put that in check with the other one. But this is computationally kind in that case, and this is not. big fan of this concept, computational kindness. It's something we can strive for both in our data visualization and the way we can communicate, but also in our lives more generally. If we're all more computationally kind, we'll make our work and our lives that bit easier, and it will make it easier for us to get along too. And that is it for me. I've got my contact details up here, so everybody please do feel free to get in touch. As I think Rachel said, they're both fully booked already. I've got a course next week and one in September, but yeah, it would be great if we could continue having some sessions after that too. I think I'm okay for timing, so I've got sort of 5 minutes if anyone's got any questions.
Yeah, we've got a few minutes, Dan. So I just want to say thanks very much for that. That was fascinating.
Cool, thank you.
And the principles of a freshly baked scone, I think. Oh no, it's something completely different. Thank you, daughter. No, that's great. We do have a couple of questions, and we've got time to look at those in a second or two. But just in case I forget, which I probably won't, those two courses are booked. There's one next week, which is fully booked. We've had a lot of interest in both of them, and they sold out very quickly. Sold out. They are free, of course, to people who work in health and care in the Midlands. So we're looking to secure a couple more dates, Dan. If you're up for it, and we can sort those out and not disappoint people. Okay, so we do have a couple of questions. So it's probably easier if I just share my screen, and then you can pick the ones that you want to
Sure.
address. So I'll just do that now. There you go.
Okay, I'll start on the left. Does R lend itself to data visualization? I am completely tool agnostic. So I think that basically whatever tool you are using or whatever code you are using, you can learn to create great data visualizations. I think a lot of visualizations that I've seen come out of R tend to look a bit naff. And I think that is just because possibly people haven't taken the time to really curate them, really edit them to make them look nice. They've just sort of, found that bit of ggplot script or whatever, they've copied and pasted it, they've plugged their data in. So I think R absolutely can lend itself to data visualization, but as with any other coding tool or any other tool out there, you just need to take your time, not just to kind of use the default, but to really really tweak and think about your color choices and your various different design decisions. Data journalism is an increasingly used term. Is this the storytelling bit, do you think? I think sort of data journalism as an area of journalism it's grown massively. There are some websites like 538.com, which are leaders in that, an American website where they look at US politics and sport really through the lens of the data and lead with data visualizations. The New York Times, the Financial Times, they've now got graphics or data journalism teams, which really do create some amazing work. And obviously they are journalists, so telling a story is absolutely at the forefront of what we do. One of my favorite authors is Alberto Cairo. Alberto Cairo comes from the world of data journalism, but he is one of the best writers in talking about data visualization and how to communicate with your charts, largely talking about the exact kind of stuff that I've just been talking about. So I guess data journalism is one field, but we can tell stories without needing to be journalists in any kind of area. On the non-data Inc. example, might it be better to consider adding some points to the line? How do you know they are monthly figures with simplified annual labels on the x-axis? I'm having to put my mind back to this now. So I think you could put points on a line. That would be something called data redundancy, I would argue, because if you've got the line and the points, they're both showing the same thing. It might be useful, and I recommend things like if you have missing data, having points on the line just allows you to show you exactly where the data is. I think I'm sort of struggling to visualize exactly how to answer your question, but I think the answer there is more about kind of the narrative around it's presented, your labels, in order to create that clarity as to exactly what is being represented in each of your axes. And possibly that is more around your labeling and the narrative and the context rather than it is in the actual non-data Inc. itself. So yeah, and just to note, the line and the point would both be data Inc. But I refer to it as redundant data Inc. because they're both showing the same thing. let's meet at 2 p.m. Yeah. Welcome to my brain if it said let's meet at 2 p.m. on Monday. Oh, sorry, apologies. No one's called me out on my grammar before, but yeah, I will go back and correct that one. I nearly always
Sorry,
use
it's just one of my bugbears. I'm so picky.
that's absolutely fine. I think, yeah,
No,
I mean,
I'm with Laura.
I can only apologise, and I'm aware, as I talk through a lot of this course, there are a lot of these little things, and I think it's a good analyst clearly has that eye for detail. And I apologize, I'm better with numbers than I am with words. I nearly always never use a pie chart, however, I think there's room for them, e.g. showing two options differ over time. So we'd use multiple pie charts. There is actually research on this with pie charts, and with two options, and in particular kind of showing progress over time, or like something like a kind of how far you are through your show on Netflix. That is one thing that pie charts have been shown to be quite good for. And I think largely because people can read a clock and you can sort of make a judgment about how far you are through the circle. That can work okay. I would still argue, though, it's a question of what questions people want answered. Because even if, say, you have two data items and one of them's 100 and one's 50, in a pie chart, it would not be immediately apparent that one of them is twice as large as the other, for example. Whereas in a bar chart, it is. So I'd always just challenge that question of, like, in terms of clarity, what do you want people to focus on? And if you want people to really absolutely and abundantly clearly see the differences and understand those differences, I'd argue a bar chart's always better. You've given us some quotes to learn from key gurus, other places to learn. Yeah, Cole Nussbaum and Knaflic is excellent. I mentioned Alberto Cairo, Stephen Few. I'm having a mental blank on other names, but I think, to be honest, you've probably got my kind of top four there. Yeah, Cole Nussbaum and Knaflic writes, and she's got more of a business background. Alberto Cairo's got like a journalism background. Stephen Few had a bit more of a technical background. So they've all coming from slightly different places, but largely they're all saying the same thing, and it's the same thing which I'm saying, which is around simplicity and just learning these few basic principles. Have you seen the National Competence Frameworks for Data Profs? How does this all feature? I have not seen the National Competency Framework, so I'll pass on that question. And yeah, the other one there is just some advice on using pie charts. So I'd be interested to look at that advice, because I would still tend to avoid them. If you are going to use them, the advice is usually, fewer segments and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I'll just launch in because I shared that. We talked about it on the NHSR podcast as well, because we have a debate between people about pie charts. There's a place sometimes for them, but I never use them. But the advice comes from the analysis function, which is closely aligned to the Government Data Science campus. So it's really useful to see, and I think they refer to some, or maybe you should feed to their thing about the advice, because that'd be really good. I think pie charts just are one of those divisive things, aren't they? And don't get onto donut charts, because then yes.
I think, as with anything, if you are going to use them, learn how to use them well. I still would always argue that I can never really see any need for them. But maybe I'm less sort of militantly anti-pie chart than I used to be.
I think we have to be careful as well, because primary school children, because I've got a child there, are taught how to draw them and do them. And so people getting in really early with the fancy look. So we have to undo years of familiarity.
Absolutely. Cool. I think that's, Tufty's book is great. Tufty is more, his books are like great coffee table books as well, in that they're full of great examples. They're not so easy to sort of consume in terms of the principles, but they're very beautiful books with lots of great examples. And I'd argue that possibly Stephen Few, Alberto Cairo are clearer in terms of actually just communicating the principles. I think that's it though, and looking good for time.
We are indeed. Yeah, so thanks. We got a minute to go, and I've just got one or two things to cover. But yeah, thanks again, Dan. It's always great to have you on. Some really great tips, making it interesting, thought-provoking, I think, is the thing. It helps us to think. Actually, instead of doing this the way I've done it for the last 2 years, I might actually redesign this and share it with my audience. Maybe try this out with somebody. Does this mean have more meaning than the way that we've always presented this information? So just another shout out for the Health and Care Analytics Conference. get yourself booked online if you're not able to come. We're all, a lot of us are going, so if you want to avoid us, book online. Otherwise, do come. And then we've got sort of up and coming huddles. Next huddle, I'm going to get you all to, or at least some of you, to really reveal your faces so I can update this picture. Look how hairy these people are. This was clearly from 3 years ago when people were middle of lockdown. Look at Simon, bless him. So coming up, we've got Zoe and Chris. We're still looking forward to them telling us more about the data science team, which is just fairly newly established, and their plans for that. The NHSE are presenting the ICB place-based allocation tool. That's possibly next time. And some of you will have been to the Analyst X Huddle the other day about the Analyst National Competency Framework. So we'll be inviting them over to us as well, so they can tell us a bit more about that, and we can tell them how we feel about that as well, so we can help them improve that before the national rollout in the autumn. Training opportunities, the prospectus is up and running, so hopefully we'll be adding those extra dates to Dan's courses. The time series, the one I really want to highlight is the time series forecasting and decision making, which starts on the 28th of June and it's 3 days. Please do register now. The one which is in September is almost all fully booked, because I think people are thinking this is, I'll do it then and not now. This one has spaces. The one in September has fewer spaces, so please get yourself booked on to that. And there's many more than these other ones, which is the Thinking Tools workshop, which is with Fraser Batty. Highly commend that one. Hugely appreciative audience of Fraser as a very experienced presenter. That's face to face, and then we have Arguing with Numbers on the 4th of July. Oh, and some sort of very random question that I was going to ask you, but if time, and I don't have time, so that's easy, so I can move on from that. I was just interested to know what people were doing. I'm going to save that for next time. You can look forward to that. You can do some homework, how I think about that question. Okay, so thanks again, Dan. Brilliant. It's lovely to see you.
No, thank you for having me.
No problem. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll see you next week at the training, and we'll see everybody else next week. In 2 weeks, sorry. So thanks everybody, and see you soon. Bye bye.